Our featured work is Othello by William Shakespeare. Before the story begins, here is a brief listening guide. Background and listening guide. Written around 1603-1604, Othello belongs to Shakespeare's mature tragedies and reflects the military, commercial, and racial tensions surrounding Venice and Cyprus. Listen for contrasts between public honor and private fear, speech and evidence, appearance and truth. Iago rarely forces events directly. He reshapes how others interpret ordinary gestures. The drama is therefore especially powerful in audio, where pauses, repetitions, tonal shifts, and unfinished suggestions reveal minds changing before actions follow. Now, let the story begin. Othello, Brabantio, the rich senator of Venice, had a fair daughter, the gentle Desdemona. She was sought by divers suitors, both on account of her many virtuous qualities and for her rich expectations. But among the suitors of her own clime and complexion, she saw none whom she could affect. For this noble lady, who regarded the mind more than the features of men, with a singularity rather to be admired than imitated, had chosen for the object of her affections a Moor, a black man, whom her father loved and often invited to his house. Neither is Desdemona to be altogether condemned for the unsuitableness of the person whom she selected for her lover. Bating that Othello was black, the noble Moor wanted nothing which might recommend him to the affections of the greatest lady. He was a soldier, and a brave one, and by his conduct in bloody wars against the Turks, he had risen to the rank of general in the Venetian service, and was esteemed and trusted by the state. He had been a traveler, and Desdemona, as is the manner of ladies, loved to hear him tell the story of his adventures, which he would run through from his earliest recollection. The battles, sieges, and encounters which he had passed through. The perils he had been exposed to by land and by water. His hair-breadth escapes when he had entered a breach or marched up to the mouth of a cannon. How he had been taken prisoner by the insolent enemy and sold into slavery. How he demeaned himself in that state. And how he escaped. All these accounts, added to the narration of the strange things he had seen in foreign countries, the vast wildernesses and romantic caverns, the quarries, the rocks and mountains whose heads are in the clouds, the savage nations, the cannibals who are man-eaters, and a race of people in Africa whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders, would so enchain the attention of Desdemona that if she were called off at any time by household affairs, she would dispatch that business with all haste and return, and with a greedy ear devour Othello's discourse. And once he took advantage of a pliant hour, and drew from her a prayer that he would tell her the whole story of his life at large, of which she had heard so much, but only in parts. To this he consented, and beguiled her of many a tear when he spoke of some distressful stroke which his youth had suffered. His story being done, she gave him for his pains a world of sighs. She swore a pretty oath that it was all passing strange and pitiful, wondrous pitiful. She wished, she said, that she had not heard it, yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. And then she thanked him, and told him that if he had a friend who loved her, he had only to teach him how to tell his story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint, delivered with no more frankness than modesty, accompanied by certain bewitching prettinesses and blushes which Othello could not but understand, he spoke more openly of his love, and in this golden opportunity gained the consent of the generous lady Desdemona privately to marry him. Neither Othello's color nor his fortune was such that it could be hoped Brabantio would accept him for a son-in-law. He had left his daughter free, but he did expect that, as was the manner of noble Venetian ladies, she would choose before long a husband of senatorial rank or expectations. But in this he was deceived. Desdemona loved the Moor, though he was black, and devoted her heart and fortunes to his valiant parts and qualities. So was her heart subdued to an implicit devotion to the man she had selected for a husband, that his very color, which to all but this discerning lady would have proved an insurmountable objection, was by her esteemed above all the white skins and clear complexions of the young Venetian nobility, her suitors. Their marriage, which, though privately carried out, could not long be kept secret, came to the ears of the old man Brabantio, who appeared in a solemn council of the Senate as an accuser of the Moor Othello, who by spells and witchcraft, he maintained, had seduced the affections of the fair Desdemona and induced her to marry him without the consent of her father, and against the obligations of hospitality. At this juncture, it happened that the state of Venice had immediate need of the services of Othello, news having arrived that the Turks, with mighty preparation, had fitted out a fleet which was bending its course towards the island of Cyprus, with intent to regain that strong post from the Venetians, who then held it. In this emergency, the state turned its eyes upon Othello, who alone was deemed adequate to conduct the defense of Cyprus against the Turks. Thus Othello, now summoned before the Senate, stood in their presence at once as a candidate for a great state employment, and as a culprit charged with offenses which, by the laws of Venice, were made capital. The age and senatorial character of old Brabantio commanded a most patient hearing from that grave assembly. But the incensed father conducted his accusation with so much intemperance, producing likelihoods and allegations as proofs, that when Othello was called upon for his defense, he had only to relate a plain tale of the course of his love. This he did with such artless eloquence, recounting the whole story of his wooing as we have related it above, and delivered his speech with so noble a plainness, the evidence of truth, that the Duke, who sat as chief judge, could not help confessing that a tale so told would have won his daughter too. The spells and conjurations which Othello had used in his courtship plainly appeared to have been no more than the honest arts of men in love. And the only witchcraft he had used was the faculty of telling a soft tale to win a lady's ear. This statement of Othello was confirmed by the testimony of the lady Desdemona herself, who appeared in court, and, professing a duty to her father for life and education, challenged leave of him to profess a yet higher duty to her lord and husband, even as much as her mother had shown in preferring him, Brabantio, above her father. The old senator, unable to maintain his plea, called the Moor to him with many expressions of sorrow, and, as an act of necessity, bestowed upon him his daughter, whom, if he had been free to withhold her, he told him, he would with all his heart have kept from him. He added that he was glad at soul that he had no other child, for this behavior of Desdemona would have taught him to be a tyrant and hang clogs on them for her desertion. This difficulty being got over, Othello, to whom custom had rendered the hardships of a military life as natural as food and rest are to other men, readily undertook the management of the wars in Cyprus. And Desdemona, preferring the honor of her lord, though attended with danger, to the indulgence of those idle delights in which newly married people usually waste their time, cheerfully consented to his going. No sooner had Othello and his lady landed in Cyprus than news arrived that a desperate tempest had dispersed the Turkish fleet. And thus the island was secure from any immediate apprehension of an attack. But the war which Othello was to suffer was now beginning, and the enemies which malice stirred up against his innocent lady proved in their nature more deadly than strangers or infidels. Among all the general's friends, no one possessed the confidence of Othello more entirely than Cassio. Michael Cassio was a young soldier, a Florentine, gay, amorous, and of pleasing address, qualities favored by women. He was handsome and eloquent, and exactly such a person as might alarm the jealousy of a man advanced in years, as Othello in some measure was, who had married a young and beautiful wife. But Othello was as free from jealousy as he was noble, and as incapable of suspecting as of doing a base action. He had employed this Cassio in his love affair with Desdemona, and Cassio had been a sort of go-between in his suit. For Othello, fearing that he himself had not those soft parts of conversation which please ladies, and finding these qualities in his friend, would often depute Cassio to go, as he phrased it, a-courting for him, such innocent simplicity being rather an honor than a blemish to the character of the valiant Moor. So it was no wonder if, next to Othello himself, but at a far distance, as beseems a virtuous wife, the gentle Desdemona loved and trusted Cassio. Nor had the marriage of this couple made any difference in their behavior towards Michael Cassio. He frequented their house, and his free and rattling talk was no unpleasing variety to Othello, who was himself of a more serious temper. For such tempers are often observed to delight in their contraries as a relief from the oppressive excess of their own. Desdemona and Cassio would talk and laugh together, as in the days when he went a-courting for his friend. Othello had lately promoted Cassio to be lieutenant, a place of trust nearest to the general's person. This promotion gave great offense to Iago, an older officer who thought he had a better claim than Cassio, and would often ridicule Cassio as a fellow fit only for the company of ladies, and one who knew no more of the art of war or how to set an army in array for battle than a girl. Iago hated Cassio, and he hated Othello as well for favoring Cassio as for an unjust suspicion which he had lightly taken up against Othello, that the Moor was too fond of Iago's wife, Emilia. From these imaginary provocations, the plotting mind of Iago conceived a horrid scheme of revenge, which should involve Cassio, the Moor, and Desdemona in one common ruin. Iago was artful and had studied human nature deeply, and he knew that, of all the torments which afflict the mind of man, far beyond bodily torture, the pains of jealousy were the most intolerable and had the sorest sting. If he could succeed in making Othello jealous of Cassio, He thought it would be an exquisite plot of revenge, and might end in the death of Cassio or Othello, or both. He cared not. The arrival of the general and his lady in Cyprus, coinciding with the news of the dispersion of the enemy's fleet, made a sort of holiday on the island. Everybody gave themselves up to feasting and merrymaking. Wine flowed in abundance, and cups went round to the health of the black Othello and his lady, the fair Desdemona. Cassio had the direction of the guard that night, with a charge from Othello to keep the soldiers from excess in drinking, so that no brawl might arise to frighten the inhabitants or disgust them with the newly landed forces. That night, Iago began his deep-laid plans of mischief. Under color of loyalty and love to the general, he enticed Cassio to make rather too free with the bottle, a great fault in an officer upon guard. Cassio resisted for a time, but he could not long hold out against the honest freedom which Iago knew how to put on. He kept swallowing glass after glass as Iago still plied him with drink and encouraging songs, and Cassio's tongue ran over in praise of the lady Desdemona, whom he toasted again and again, affirming that she was a most exquisite lady, until at last the enemy which he put into his mouth stole away his brains. Upon some provocation given him by a fellow whom Iago had set on, swords were drawn, and Montano, a worthy officer who interfered to appease the dispute, was wounded in the scuffle. The riot now began to be general, and Iago, who had set the mischief on foot, was foremost in spreading the alarm, causing the castle bell to be rung, as if some dangerous mutiny, instead of a slight drunken quarrel, had arisen. The ringing of the alarm bell awakened Othello, who, dressing in a hurry and coming to the scene of action, questioned Cassio about the cause. Cassio had now come to himself, the effect of the wine having somewhat worn off, but was too much ashamed to reply. Iago, pretending great reluctance to accuse Cassio, but being, as it were, forced into it by Othello, who insisted on knowing the truth, gave an account of the whole matter, leaving out his own share in it, which Cassio was too far gone to remember, in such a manner that, while he seemed to make Cassio's offense less, he in fact made it appear greater than it was. The result was that Othello, who was a strict observer of discipline, was compelled to take away Cassio's place as lieutenant. Thus did Iago's first artifice succeed completely. He had now undermined his hated rival and thrust him out of his place, but a further use was hereafter to be made of the adventure of this disastrous night. Cassio, whom this misfortune had entirely sobered, now lamented to his seeming friend Iago that he should have been such a fool as to transform himself into a beast. He was undone, for how could he ask the general for his place again? He would tell him he was a drunkard. He despised himself. Iago, affecting to make light of it, said that he, or any man living, might be drunk upon occasion. It remained now to make the best of a bad bargain. The general's wife was now the general, and could do anything with Othello. He had best apply to the lady Desdemona to mediate for him with her lord. She was of a frank, obliging disposition, and would readily undertake a good office of this sort, and set Cassio right again in the general's favor. Then this crack in their love would be made stronger than ever. It was good advice from Iago, if it had not been given for wicked purposes, as will hereafter appear. Cassio did as Iago advised him, and made application to the lady Desdemona, who was easily won over in any honest suit. She promised Cassio that she would be his solicitor with her lord, and would rather die than give up his cause. She immediately set about this in so earnest and pretty a manner that Othello, who was mortally offended with Cassio, could not put her off. When he pleaded for delay and said that it was too soon to pardon such an offender, she would not be beaten back, but insisted that it should be the next night, or the morning after. Or the next morning after that at the latest. Then she showed how penitent and humbled poor Cassio was, and that his offense did not deserve so sharp a check. And when Othello still hung back, she said, "What, my lord? That I should have so much to do to plead for Cassio, Michael Cassio, who came a courting for you, and oftentimes when I have spoken in dispraise of you, has taken your part. I count this but a little thing to ask of you. When I mean to try your love indeed, I shall ask a weighty matter." Othello could deny nothing to such a pleader, and only requesting that Desdemona would leave the time to him, promised to receive Michael Cassio into favor again. It happened that Othello and Iago entered the room where Desdemona was, just as Cassio, who had been imploring her intercession, was departing through the opposite door. Iago, who was full of art, said in a low voice, as if to himself, "I like not that." Othello took no great notice of what he said. Indeed, the conference which immediately took place with his lady put it out of his head, but he remembered it afterwards. For when Desdemona was gone, Iago, as if merely to satisfy a thought, questioned Othello as to whether Michael Cassio, when Othello was courting his lady, knew of his love. To this the general answered in the affirmative, adding that he had gone between them very often during the courtship. Iago knitted his brow as if he had gained fresh light on some terrible matter, and cried, "Indeed?" This brought into Othello's mind the words which Iago had let fall upon entering the room and seeing Cassio with Desdemona, and he began to think there was some meaning in all this. For he deemed Iago to be a just man, full of love and honesty, and what in a false knave would be tricks seemed in him to be the natural workings of an honest mind. Big with something too great for utterance. Othello prayed Iago to speak what he knew, and to give his worst thoughts words. "And what," said Iago, "if some thoughts very vile should have intruded into my breast, as where is the palace into which foul things do not enter?" Then Iago went on to say what a pity it would be if any trouble should arise to Othello out of his imperfect observations. That it would not be for Othello's peace to know his thoughts, and that people's good names were not to be taken away on slight suspicions. When Othello's curiosity was raised almost to distraction by these hints and scattered words, Iago, as if in earnest care for Othello's peace of mind, besought him to beware of jealousy. With such art did this villain raise suspicions in the unguarded Othello by the very caution which he pretended to give him against suspicion. "I know," said Othello, "that my wife is fair, loves company and feasting, is free of speech, and sings, plays, and dances well. But where virtue is, these qualities are virtuous. I must have proof before I think her dishonest." Then Iago, as if glad that Othello was slow to believe ill of his lady, frankly declared that he had no proof, but begged Othello to observe her behavior well when Cassio was by, and to be neither jealous nor too secure, for he, Iago, knew the dispositions of the Italian ladies, his countrywomen, better than Othello could. In Venice, the wives let heaven see many pranks they dared not show their husbands. Then he artfully insinuated that Desdemona had deceived her father in marrying Othello, and had carried it so closely that the poor old man thought witchcraft had been used. Othello was much moved by this argument, which brought the matter home to him, for if she had deceived her father, why might she not deceive her husband? Iago begged pardon for having moved him, but Othello, assuming indifference while he was really shaken with inward grief at Iago's words, begged him to go on. Iago did so with many apologies, as if unwilling to produce anything against Cassio, whom he called his friend. He then came strongly to the point, and reminded Othello how Desdemona had refused many suitable matches of her own clime and complexion, and had married him, a Moor, which appeared unnatural in her, and proved her to have a headstrong will. When her better judgment returned, how probable it was that she should begin comparing Othello with the fine forms and clear white complexions of the young Italians, her countrymen. He concluded by advising Othello to put off his reconciliation with Cassio a little longer, and, in the meantime, to note with what earnestness Desdemona should intercede on his behalf. For much would be seen in that. So mischievously did this artful villain lay his plots to turn the gentle qualities of this innocent lady to her destruction, and make a net for her out of her own goodness to entrap her, first setting Cassio on to entreat her mediation, and then, out of that very mediation, contriving stratagems for her ruin. The conference ended with Iago begging Othello to account his wife innocent until he had more decisive proof, and Othello promised to be patient. But from that moment, the deceived Othello never tasted contentment of mind. Neither poppy, nor the juice of mandragora, nor all the sleeping potions in the world could ever again restore to him that sweet rest which he had enjoyed but yesterday. His occupation sickened upon him. He no longer took delight in arms. His heart, which used to be roused at the sight of troops, banners, and battle array, and would stir and leap at the sound of a drum, a trumpet, or a neighing war-horse, seemed to have lost all that pride and ambition which are a soldier's virtue. And his military ardor and all his old joys forsook him. Sometimes he thought his wife honest, and at other times he thought her not so. Sometimes he thought Iago just, and at other times he thought him not so. Then he would wish that he had never known of it. He was none the worse for her loving Cassio, so long as he knew it not. Torn to pieces by these distracting thoughts, he once laid hold of Iago's throat and demanded proof of Desdemona's guilt, threatening him with instant death for having belied her. Iago, feigning indignation that his honesty should be taken for a vice, asked Othello whether he had not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in his wife's hand. Othello answered that he had given her such a one, and that it was his first gift. "That same handkerchief," said Iago, "did I see Michael Cassio wipe his face with this day." "If it be as you say," said Othello, "I will not rest until a wide revenge swallows them up." First, as a token of your fidelity, I expect that Cassio shall be put to death within 3 days. And for that fair devil, meaning his lady, I will withdraw and devise some swift means of death for her. Trifles light as air are to the jealous proofs as strong as Holy Writ. A handkerchief of his wife's, seen in Cassio's hand, was motive enough for the deluded Othello to pass sentence of death upon them both, without once inquiring how Cassio came by it. Desdemona had never given such a present to Cassio, nor would this constant lady have wronged her lord by doing so naughty a thing as giving his presents to another man. Both Cassio and Desdemona were innocent of any offense against Othello, but the wicked Iago, whose spirits never slept in the contrivance of villainy, had made his wife, a good but weak woman, steal this handkerchief from Desdemona, under pretense of getting the work copied. But in reality, to drop it in Cassio's way, where he might find it, and give a handle to Iago's suggestion that it was Desdemona's present. Othello, soon after meeting his wife, pretended that he had a headache, as indeed he might with truth, and desired her to lend him her handkerchief to hold to his temples. She did so. "Not this," said Othello, "but that handkerchief I gave you." Desdemona did not have it about her, for indeed it had been stolen, as we have related. "How?" said Othello. "This is a fault indeed. That handkerchief an Egyptian woman gave to my mother. The woman was a witch and could read people's thoughts. She told my mother that, while she kept it, it would make her amiable and my father would love her. But if she lost it or gave it away, my father's fancy would turn, and he would loathe her as much as he had loved her. When she was dying, she gave it to me and bade me, if I ever married, give it to my wife. I did so. Take heed of it. Make it a darling as precious as your eye." "Is it possible?" said the frightened lady. "It is true," continued Othello. "It is a magical handkerchief. A sibyl who had lived in the world for 200 years worked it in a fit of prophetic fury. The silkworms that furnished the silk were hallowed, and it was dyed in a mummy made from maidens' hearts conserved. Desdemona, hearing of the wondrous virtues of the handkerchief, was ready to die with fear, for she plainly perceived that she had lost it, and with it, she feared, the affections of her husband. Then Othello started, and looked as if he were going to do some rash thing, and still he demanded the handkerchief. When she could not produce it, she tried to divert her husband from too serious thoughts, and cheerfully told him she saw that all his talk about the handkerchief was only to put her off from her suit concerning Michael Cassio, whom she went on to praise, as Iago had foretold, until Othello, in perfect distraction, burst out of the room. Then Desdemona, though unwillingly, began to suspect that her lord was jealous. What cause she could have given him, she knew not. Then she accused herself for accusing the noble Othello, and thought that surely some untoward news from Venice, or some troubles of state, had troubled his spirits and made his temper less sweet than formerly. She said, "Men are not gods, and we must not look for that observance from them when they are married, which they show us on the bridal day." And she beshrewed herself for so unkindly judging his unkindness. Again Othello and Desdemona met, and he accused her more plainly of being unfaithful and of loving another man, but he did not name whom. Othello wept, and Desdemona said, "Alas, the heavy day! Why do you weep?" Othello told her that he could have borne all sorts of evils with fortitude, poverty, disease, and disgrace. But her infidelity had broken his heart. He called her a weed that looked so fair and smelt so sweet that the sense ached at it and wished she had never been born. When he had left her, this innocent lady was so stupefied with wonder at her lord's untrue suspicion of her that a weight-like sleep came over her. She only desired her attendant to make her bed and lay her wedding sheets upon it, saying that when people teach their babes, they do so by gentle means and easy tasks. And Othello might have chid her so. For, in good faith, she was but a child when she was chidden. This was all the complaint that this gentle lady made. Desdemona, having retired to bed and expecting her lord to follow her, soon fell into a slumber, the effect of her troubled spirits. Then Othello entered the chamber, full of the black purpose he had meditated of putting his lady to death. But when he saw her asleep, he thought he would not shed her blood, or scar that white skin of hers, whiter than alabaster. Yet he was resolved that she should die. Otherwise, as he said, she would live to betray more men, as she had betrayed him. Then he kissed her for the last time, as he said, and that kiss was so sweet that he must needs kiss her again. He wept, but he said they were cruel tears. Desdemona was awakened by his kisses, and she looked upon Othello and saw him gnaw his underlip and roll his eyes. She knew he was always fatal when he looked so. He bade her prepare for death and say her prayers, for he would not kill her soul. This innocent wife, as she lay at his mercy, begged for compassion and to know her fault. Then he named Cassio and the handkerchief which, he said, she had given him. As the guiltless lady was proceeding to clear herself, he suddenly refused to hear any more, but, covering her up in the bedclothes, stifled her until she died. At this instant, Cassio was brought into the house, wounded and bleeding. Iago had set one of his creatures on to assassinate him, but the fellow had not succeeded in his attempt to kill Cassio, whom he had wounded, though not mortally. The fellow had himself been killed by Iago to prevent discovery, and in his pockets were found certain letters which made the guilt of Iago and the innocence of Cassio clear beyond all doubt. Cassio now came to beg Othello's pardon and ask how he had offended him, that he had employed Iago to murder him. This discovery came as a thunderstroke to Othello, who now plainly saw that he was no better than a murderer, and that his wife, the poor innocent lady, had always been faithful to him. The extreme anguish of this discovery made life insupportable. He fell upon his sword, and, throwing himself upon the body of his dear injured lady, expired. These rash acts raised much passion of horror and amazement in the bystanders, for Othello had borne a fair reputation. And until he was wrought upon by the arts of a villain whom his own noble nature never gave him leave to suspect, he had been a loving and doting husband. He had loved not wisely, but too well, and his manly eyes, when he learned his mistake, though not used to weep on every small occasion, dropped tears as fast as the Arabian trees drop their gum. When he was dead, all his former merits and his valiant acts were remembered. Nothing now remained for his successor but to put the utmost censure of the law into force against Iago, who was executed with strict tortures, and to send word to the state of Venice of the lamentable death of their renowned general. The reading is followed by a deeper literary commentary. William Shakespeare's Othello is a tragedy in which interpretation becomes action and imagined knowledge acquires the force of fact. The play's catastrophe does not arise simply from jealousy as an isolated emotion, but from competing narratives about identity, loyalty, desire, and social belonging. Marcia Macaulay's attention to narrative and narrative analysis helps reveal how characters do not merely experience events. They organize them into stories that explain what others intend and what the future must mean. Iago's power depends on his ability to supply a persuasive plot where evidence is incomplete. He turns pauses, gestures, memories, and coincidences into a seemingly coherent account of betrayal, while Othello gradually abandons the more complex story of his marriage for a narrower and more violent script. The tragic movement, therefore, lies in the replacement of uncertainty by false certainty. Simon Palfrey's cognitive and psychoanalytic approach sharpens this process by examining the burden of mind reading. Iago survives through a highly developed theory of mind. He predicts how others will interpret appearances, anticipates their emotional needs, and adjusts his language to the vulnerabilities he detects. Yet his apparent mastery also exposes the danger of treating another consciousness as fully knowable. Othello is drawn into the same error. He becomes convinced that hidden motives can be read from fragments, and his desire to penetrate Desdemona's inner life transforms intimacy into interrogation. The handkerchief matters because it seems to make inward truth visible, although its meaning has been manufactured by manipulation. Shakespeare thus stages cognition itself as unstable, showing how the effort to understand another person may be corrupted by fear, fantasy, and the wish for control. Vanessa Corredera's study of Othello in post-racial America extends the play's significance into modern cultural life by showing that its racial meanings are continually reanimated rather than left behind. Othello's position as a celebrated military figure and a racially marked outsider creates a tension that later performances and adaptations cannot neutralize by claiming to have moved beyond race. His public value does not free him from the narratives imposed upon his body, marriage, and masculinity. The tragedy exposes how admiration can coexist with exclusion, and how social acceptance may remain conditional. The play's enduring difficulty lies in its refusal to separate private error from public language. Personal catastrophe is shaped by inherited assumptions, theatrical conventions, and habits of interpretation that make deception credible. Read together, these approaches show a work preoccupied with the stories people tell about minds they cannot access and identities they refuse to see without prejudice. Shakespeare's achievement is to bind narrative, cognition, and race into one destructive mechanism. Iago does not create every fear he exploits. He activates structures already present in Othello's world and in Othello's understanding of himself. The result is a tragedy in which language does not merely describe reality, but reorganizes it until suspicion feels like knowledge, performance appears to be truth. And a man who has commanded armies loses command of the story by which he judges love, honor, and himself. Othello begins with a marriage that appears capable of overcoming social division. Desdemona has chosen Othello not through parental arrangement, economic calculation, or fascination with outward appearance, but through attentive sympathy. She listens to the history of his life, responds to the sufferings that formed him, and recognizes nobility in experience and character. Othello, in turn, understands her listening as an act of love. Their courtship is founded upon narrative. He speaks, she hears, and each discovers in the other a form of recognition unavailable elsewhere. This origin gives the tragedy its deepest irony. A union created through truthful storytelling is destroyed when a false storyteller seizes control of its meaning. From the beginning, Othello occupies an unstable position in Venetian society. He is honored as a general and needed as a defender, yet he is also treated as socially alien. The state trusts his military skill when Cyprus is threatened, but Brabantio cannot imagine that Desdemona freely chose him. He therefore explains the marriage through sorcery. Such an accusation reveals more than paternal anger. It shows a culture willing to admire Othello's usefulness while doubting his full humanity. He may command armies, address senators, and preserve Venetian territory, but his acceptance remains conditional. This tension does not mechanically cause his later jealousy, yet it creates vulnerabilities that Iago knows how to exploit. Othello's public confidence has been built through achievement, discipline, and service. His private confidence is less secure because it depends upon believing that Desdemona's extraordinary choice can endure. The early hearing before the Senate presents Othello at his most composed. His defense is calm because truth and language still support one another. He does not need elaborate rhetoric or manufactured evidence. He simply recounts how affection developed, and Desdemona confirms his account. Their testimonies agree because their shared past is real. The scene establishes a standard of honest judgment. Accusations are heard, witnesses speak, and claims are tested. The later tragedy reverses this process. Othello abandons open inquiry, refuses Desdemona a meaningful hearing, and accepts insinuation in place of testimony. His fall is therefore not merely emotional. It is also a collapse in his method of knowing. When the action moves from Venice to Cyprus, the external war ends almost immediately. A storm destroys the Turkish threat, leaving Othello without the military enemy he was prepared to confront. The setting becomes psychologically significant. Cyprus is a fortified edge of Venetian power, distant from the civic institutions that might restrain private passions. In this exposed environment, Iago redirects the language of warfare inward. Suspicion becomes reconnaissance, love becomes contested territory, and imagined betrayal becomes an offense demanding punishment. Othello remains a soldier, but his strategic habits are turned against his own household. He seeks certainty, loyalty, proof, and decisive action, yet he applies these demands to intimate life, where motives cannot be read as plainly as troop movements. Iago's first success is his corruption of Cassio's public standing. Cassio's weakness is not malice, but inexperience with his own limits. He knows that alcohol affects him badly, yet allows himself to be persuaded into drinking while on duty. Iago then arranges circumstances in which a manageable failure appears to reveal unfitness for command. This episode displays his preferred method. He does not create every weakness he uses. Instead, he identifies an existing tendency, places pressure upon it, and controls the interpretation of the result. Cassio supplies the drunkenness, but Iago supplies the occasion, the provocation, the alarm, and the report. Evil in the narrative works less like supernatural power than like expert editing. Cassio's loss of office also introduces the idea of reputation. To Cassio, reputation is the outward form through which his inner worth becomes socially visible. Once disgraced, he feels that an essential part of himself has been destroyed. Iago mocks this concern while secretly understanding reputation better than anyone. He knows that people act according to what they believe others to be. Othello trusts honest Iago. Desdemona regards Cassio as a worthy friend. Cassio sees Iago as a practical counselor. Iago's greatest resource is therefore not secrecy alone, but reputation accumulated through performance. Because he appears reluctant to accuse, his accusations seem responsible. Because he speaks as though protecting Othello, his cruelty appears loyal. Because he warns against jealousy, he disguises the fact that he is manufacturing it. Desdemona's advocacy for Cassio is an expression of moral consistency. She believes he deserves forgiveness and confidently uses her influence for a just purpose. Her persistence also reflects the openness of her marriage, as she understands it. She does not imagine that ordinary conversation with Cassio requires concealment, nor that compassion could be interpreted as sexual guilt. Iago's scheme depends upon converting these virtues into suspicious signs. Frankness becomes impropriety. Loyalty becomes desire, and intercession becomes evidence. His genius lies in making innocence collaborate unknowingly in its own misrepresentation. Desdemona does precisely what a generous person should do, yet each generous action is placed inside a false narrative. Iago rarely begins with a direct assertion. Instead, he uses hesitation, questions, fragments, and apparent reluctance. His "I like not that" is effective because it seems involuntary, as though a troubling truth has escaped before prudence could suppress it. Othello then performs much of the destructive labor himself. He asks what Iago means, recalls Cassio's role in the courtship, and connects separate facts into a pattern. Iago offers interpretive prompts rather than a complete accusation. This technique allows Othello to experience suspicion as his own discovery. A lie imposed from outside might be resisted. A lie assembled within the victim's imagination acquires the force of insight. The tragedy carefully distinguishes jealousy from simple possessiveness. Othello's agony arises from a crisis of identity as much as from fear of sexual betrayal. He has believed himself loved for the very qualities that distinguish him: his history, endurance, courage, and difference from the conventional Venetian suitors. Iago persuades him that these differences are actually defects Desdemona will eventually recognize. Her marriage is recast as an unnatural impulse from which she may recover. Othello begins to see himself through the hostile assumptions of the society around him. His age, color, foreignness, and lack of courtly ease become arguments against his own lovability. Iago does not merely make him distrust Desdemona. He makes him distrust the meaning of her original choice. Brabantio's earlier warning also returns with poisoned force. Desdemona deceived her father by marrying secretly, so Iago suggests that she may deceive her husband as well. The argument ignores the moral difference between resisting unjust parental control and violating marital fidelity. Yet it feels persuasive because it converts a past fact into a predictive pattern. Iago continually removes actions from their proper contexts. Cassio's departure, Desdemona's pleading, her secret marriage, and the missing handkerchief are all real, but none means what he claims. Shakespeare's tragedy thus shows that facts alone do not guarantee truth. Meaning depends upon arrangement, context, and the ethical quality of the interpreter. The handkerchief condenses the entire crisis into a physical object. As Othello's first gift, it carries private memory and emotional significance. Once lost, however, it passes beyond Desdemona's control and becomes available for Iago's manipulation. Othello treats it as material proof because he longs to escape uncertainty. Yet the handkerchief proves only that an object has moved, not that a betrayal has occurred. Its apparent solidity conceals the weakness of the conclusion drawn from it. The more unstable Othello feels, the more desperately he invests the object with certainty. His elaborate account of its magical origin further transforms it from a token of affection into a test of obedience and possession. Emilia's involvement adds another layer of moral complexity. She takes the handkerchief to satisfy Iago without understanding his design. Her action is wrong, but not equivalent to his calculated evil. She has lived within a marriage where affection and approval appear scarce, and she responds to the opportunity to please her husband. The tragedy repeatedly shows small compromises entering larger systems of harm. Cassio drinks one more cup. Emilia takes one object. Othello postpones direct conversation, and Desdemona avoids admitting that the handkerchief is lost. None intends the final catastrophe, but Iago binds these separate choices together. His power depends upon other people acting partially, impulsively, or fearfully. Othello's demand for proof initially seems rational, yet he soon accepts the weakest form of evidence because jealousy changes the standard by which evidence is judged. Once suspicion takes root, ambiguity no longer remains neutral. Everything begins to confirm the feared conclusion. Desdemona's concern for Cassio appears excessive. Her inability to produce the handkerchief appears evasive. Her bewilderment appears deceitful. This is the self-sealing logic of jealousy. Denial becomes further proof, while innocence loses the ability to appear innocent. Othello does not simply receive false information. He enters a condition in which correction becomes psychologically intolerable. His emotional transformation is marked by the loss of inward rest and professional purpose. Let us now examine the work through its primary analytical perspective. Othello can be read as a tragedy of human value, distorted by the institutions that claim to recognize it. Venice praises Othello because his military skill protects the Republic, yet the same society never fully grants him cultural belonging. He is useful to the state, admired in public, and trusted in war, but he remains vulnerable in private because race, age, origin, and marriage mark him as an outsider. This contradiction gives the story its humanistic force. The general possesses courage, discipline, eloquence, and earned authority. But none of these qualities can secure him against a social imagination already prepared to regard his union with Desdemona as unnatural. Brabantio's accusation of witchcraft exposes the prejudice beneath Venetian civility. Rather than believe that his daughter freely chose a black foreigner, he prefers to imagine enchantment. Desdemona's love, therefore, challenges not only paternal authority, but also a hierarchy of color, class, and nationality. The cultural world of the work is divided between Venice and Cyprus. Venice represents law, diplomacy, social rank, and verbal order. There, Othello can defend himself through narrative, and Desdemona can speak publicly for her own choice. Cyprus, by contrast, is a military frontier stripped of the stabilizing rituals of civic life. Once the Turkish threat disappears, violence turns inward. The external enemy is replaced by suspicion, rivalry, and domestic terror. This movement from Senate chamber to isolated garrison is symbolically crucial. It shows how fragile civilized identity becomes when institutions recede and individuals are left exposed to private fear. Othello, who can command armies, proves unable to govern interpretation within his own household. The tragedy thus asks whether political honor has any value when moral judgment collapses. Storytelling is another central humanistic concern. Othello wins Desdemona through the account of his life. Suffering becomes language, language becomes sympathy, and sympathy becomes love. His narrative allows her to see the person whom Venetian prejudice reduces to racial difference. Yet Iago also rules through stories. He does not create convincing evidence so much as he teaches Othello how to read ordinary gestures as signs of betrayal. Cassio's departure, Desdemona's advocacy, a missing handkerchief, and familiar conversation are arranged into a false plot. The work contrasts two uses of imagination. Othello's life story opens one human being to another, while Iago's insinuations close the mind around a fiction. The handkerchief gathers these conflicts into a single symbol. As a love token, it represents memory, trust, inheritance, and the private bond between husband and wife. Once removed from Desdemona's possession, it becomes an object detached from truth and made to carry whatever meaning jealousy assigns to it. Othello treats it as sacred proof because he has already surrendered the harder duties of reason, patience, and conversation. The handkerchief, therefore, symbolizes the dangerous human desire to turn uncertainty into certainty. Othello's faith in its power reveals how quickly symbolic meaning can harden into fatal judgment when emotional fear seeks external confirmation. Desdemona embodies a moral ideal of constancy, yet the work does not present her simply as passive innocence. Her choice of husband is intellectually and socially bold. She judges Othello by experience and character rather than by Venetian convention. Before the Senate, she articulates a mature ethics of divided duty, acknowledging what she owes her father while asserting the new bond she has freely chosen. The tragedy lies partly in the conversion of these virtues into apparent crimes. Frankness becomes looseness, compassion becomes desire, persistence becomes concealment, and loyalty becomes deception. Iago triumphs because he makes goodness illegible. Othello's fall is therefore not the destruction of an essentially savage man, but the corruption of a morally serious one. His greatness and his weakness spring from the same source. He believes intensely in honor, fidelity, and transparent loyalty. Because he imagines himself incapable of treachery, he is slow to recognize it in Iago. Because he invests marriage with absolute meaning, the suspicion of betrayal becomes not one pain among others, but the collapse of his entire world. His error is not that he loves too deeply in any admirable sense, but that he allows possessive certainty to replace knowledge of the beloved. He ceases to treat Desdemona as a speaking person and turns her into a symbol of either purity or corruption. Iago represents the dark parody of humanist intelligence. He understands rhetoric, motive, reputation, weakness, and social appearance, but he uses knowledge without ethical responsibility. His study of human nature produces manipulation rather than wisdom. He recognizes that people often interpret the world according to prior fear, and he supplies each victim with the fiction most suited to that fear. Cassio fears disgrace, Roderigo desires possession, Othello fears sexual and racial humiliation, and Emilia initially obeys without grasping the consequences. The work also exposes the unequal moral standards governing men and women. Male reputation can be damaged by drunkenness and repaired through patronage, but female reputation is imagined as sexually absolute and almost impossible to defend once questioned. Desdemona is condemned without trial in the private court of her husband's mind. Her body becomes the field on which male honor is supposedly lost or restored. Even Othello's wish not to shed her blood aestheticizes violence while denying her testimony. The language of purity conceals the reality of control. At its deepest level, Othello is a tragedy about the failure to recognize another person's inward freedom. Brabantio cannot imagine Desdemona choosing Othello. Othello cannot imagine her innocence once jealousy has supplied a rival explanation. Iago refuses the moral reality of everyone around him, treating persons as instruments. Against these failures, the work places moments of genuine recognition. Desdemona listening to Othello's history, the Senate hearing his defense, Emilia finally exposing the plot, and Othello's terrible final knowledge. Yet recognition comes too late. The humanistic warning is severe. Dignity depends not only on noble feeling, but on disciplined attention, ethical interpretation, and the willingness to let other people speak before judgment becomes irreversible. A second perspective reveals further dimensions of the work. A psychoanalytic reading of Othello reveals a drama in which desire is inseparable from fear. Othello desires Desdemona, but he also desires certainty that her love confirms his worth. Because he occupies an insecure place within Venetian society, her choice seems to overcome racial exclusion, age difference, and cultural distance. Once Iago suggests betrayal, those buried anxieties return. Jealousy is not created from nothing. It activates fears that Othello has repressed beneath military confidence. Iago works by giving shape to unconscious suspicion. He rarely states an accusation directly. Instead, he pauses, hints, withdraws, and invites Othello to complete the fantasy himself. This method is psychologically effective because the resulting images feel self-generated. Othello becomes both victim and author of the imagined adultery. His demand for proof is therefore unstable. He asks for evidence, yet he is already interpreting every sign through desire and dread. The handkerchief functions as a fetishized object, concentrating diffuse anxiety into something visible. It allows Othello to treat emotional terror as material certainty. The triangle among Othello, Desdemona, and Cassio also exposes displaced desire and rivalry. Cassio represents youth, beauty, social ease, and Venetian belonging. Othello's jealousy is directed not only toward Desdemona's supposed desire for Cassio, but toward Cassio as an image of what Othello fears he lacks. By imagining that Desdemona prefers Cassio, Othello confronts a humiliating fantasy of replacement. Desdemona's independence is also difficult for Othello to integrate. He loves that she chose freely, yet freedom means that she could choose again. The very autonomy that made her love meaningful becomes, under pressure, a source of terror. His mind resolves this conflict by splitting her into opposites. She is either perfectly pure or wholly corrupt, angel or devil, beloved wife or contaminating deceiver. Repression appears in the movement from tenderness to violence. Othello attempts to present the killing as justice rather than rage, claiming that Desdemona must die to prevent future betrayal. This moral language disguises possessive injury. His controlled ritual before the murder reveals an effort to master unbearable emotion through ceremony. Love has been forced into conflict with a fantasy of dishonor, and violence becomes the catastrophic attempt to end that inner division. Iago's motives remain partly opaque, which suits a psychoanalytic approach. His resentment over promotion and his suspicion concerning Emilia do not fully explain the intensity of his destruction. His pleasure lies in control, secrecy, and the power to implant thoughts in others. Manipulation gives him mastery over a world in which he feels overlooked. He can imitate loyalty, but cannot participate in mutual trust, so he attacks the bonds he cannot inhabit. The final recognition is traumatic because it collapses Othello's defensive fantasy. Desdemona's innocence forces him to see that the enemy was internal as well as external. Iago deceived him, but jealousy found power in his own fears. His suicide joins punishment, reunion, and escape. The tragedy ends with knowledge, but not healing. Unconscious conflict has already been translated into irreversible action. Finally, here are several companion works worth reading. Toni Morrison's Beloved is a powerful companion because it likewise examines trauma, memory, love, and the destructive return of what has not been psychologically mastered. Nella Larson's Passing offers a related study of racial perception, social performance, jealousy, and the instability of identity under the gaze of others. Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier connects closely through its unreliable interpretations of marriage, fidelity, and betrayal, showing how private narratives can become more powerful than facts. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby also illuminates the danger of idealizing another person until love becomes inseparable from fantasy, status, and self-invention. Finally, Ian McEwan's Atonement provides a modern parallel to Othello's concern with misreading, an interpretation formed from